So the fact that The Exorcist has so many sequels is something that really bothers me. I hate that studios will constantly push out more and more sequels to a successful film, especially successful horror films that clearly are supposed to be one-ofs, and not let them just continue to be classics. What really gets me is the fact that The Exorcist has two prequels that were released less than a year apart, and I'm fascinated by the production history that these two films had. The first one made was directed by Paul Schrader, and he made a dark character study type film that the studio didn't like because they wanted something more classically horror. So they bring on Rennie Harlin to do reshoots, planning for it to just be quick adjustments, but they end up having to recast and honestly reshoot most of the film to fit this more traditional horror vibe that they wanted. Harlan's film, Exorcist The Beginning, comes out and isn't received well, doesn't make a ton of money, so the studio just decides to also release Schrader's film, now called Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, and it doesn't do well at the box office either, but gets a little more critical acclaim. Anyways, I watched both of them, and we're gonna talk about it. I'm Greg, and this is the two Exorcist prequels. Let's do this. So this is the reshot, recut, remade version that Rennie Harlin did, and it shows. While Vittorio Storaro's cinematography is excellent, that's all the film really has going for it to me. Although I will give it to Stellan Skarsgård, his performance in both versions of this movie works pretty well. But otherwise, I didn't enjoy this movie. Everything really felt flat, and the plot lacked any real weight to it. There's no atmosphere, and the scare scenes, they aren't exciting at all. The story overall is just boring. It doesn't really feel like anything's going on until the end of the film, with a climax that I thought was pretty good, compared to the rest of the film at least, where the final exorcism and the twist that the kid you think is possessed isn't who's possessed. That's not bad, that lands. But it's a good idea at the end of a bad film, and by then I was checked out, if I'm gonna be honest. Moving on. Now this is a movie. Dominion has a distinct vision and very clear themes on the evil that men do and its roots in demonology or whatever it's called. And it's all so well communicated throughout the entire movie. It's a slow burn of a film, but in a good way, where it takes its time to develop its characters and their relationships and all the stuff that it wants to say. I was impressed by it, honestly, especially after watching the prior version. The third act is kind of where Dominion falls apart, for me. I think that once the demon is doing their thing in the church, we spend way too much time with Father Marin debating what he's going to do, sort of. He goes to see the demon, he goes back to the village, he talks to people, he goes back to the demon. Whereas I think it could have become more cohesive in him refinding his fate as he needs to do. And I wish that they just tightened it up there, because otherwise this film is surprisingly good. I think there's just a way that this third act could have worked better. That said, you really get into the Father Marin character's head so much more in this. You really understand his motivations throughout, despite this weak third act. Now, let's compare them. The Beginning is just a much messier movie. You could tell that it was more or less made by picking apart the stuff the studio wanted from Dominion and then building a traditional horror film around it, and that's not good. You know, despite being brought on to direct Dominion as a hired gun, Paul Schrader really makes his film a singular vision to the point where it seems like it could have been a passion project of his. Both movies use a World War II storyline as flashbacks to understand Marin's backstory. And it's paralleled later on in the film as like the disaster moment of Act 2. And that just works very well for the film. The beginning, on the other hand, cuts to bits of it here and there throughout the film as sort of memories or dreams or whatever it was, until finally revealing the whole thing roughly halfway through the movie. And while I get what they were going for, it just felt a lot more disjointed and doesn't tie into the theming of the movie at all like it does with Dominion. And I think that speaks to what the problem of The Beginning has throughout, which is the fact that it feels like a job getting done by a filmmaker and not a piece of art being made. Roger Ebert, in his review for Exorcist The Beginning, said, "I've seen both versions, and I much prefer Schrader's. And yet it must be said that Harlan did not prostitute himself in his version." And while that's a way of describing it, I guess, I do agree with the general statement. This isn't the disaster it could have been, and it's definitely not a Justice League 2017 type scenario. And that's probably what's craziest to me about this whole thing, is that it was less than a year before they put out Schrader's version. There was no long fan campaign demanding its release. No pressure from the director to have his vision shown to the world. The studio just decided, well, the one we meddled with didn't work, why don't we put out the original and see if that does better? And while it wasn't a financial success, it is more critically loved, and I think if people have seen both, it's the one audiences prefer. And I just find that amusing. Though that being said, Paul Schrader has made better films about troubled men dealing with religion that I think would take priority watch over this. Still worth it though if you want to dive into some Exorcist lore for whatever reason. If you've seen these movies and have one you prefer, or if you just like this video, let me know. Leave a comment if you like, all that stuff YouTubers ask you to do. And until next time, have a good one.